everyone. This is Dee Marley with the History Bards podcast. Thank you for joining us today. This week, we are interviewing historical author Tamar Anolic. Hi, Tamar. Thank you for joining us today. How are you doing today?
I'm doing great, Dee. Thank you so much for having me.
Great. Well, we're so glad to have you on the show today. And as a way of introduction for our listeners, Tamar is a writer who specializes in historical fiction and military fiction. Her short stories have been published in the Copperfield Review, the Sandy River Review, the Helix, the Foliette Oak, Frontier Tales, Pen in Hand, Evening Streets Review, Everyday Fiction, and the Magazine of History and Fiction. Tamar's historical books span the eras and countries, focusing on the Old West and the Romanovs. Her short story collection, The Lonely Spirit, follows half-Comanche Marshal L.S. Quinn across the Old West. This book has won an Indy Bragg Medallion, was a winner for the historical fiction in the Firebird Book Awards, and was longlisted for the Book of the Year Awards and received the highly recommended Award of Excellence from us, the Historical Fiction Company. Tamar's most recent book on the Romanovs is Tales of the Romanov Empire, which has been longlisted for the Goethe Awards for Late Historical Fiction, and also was longlisted for the Historical Fiction Company's Book of the Year Awards in 2022. Her other books about the Romanovs are The Russian Riddle, a nonfiction biography, and the novella Triumph of a Tsar, Through the Fire, and The Imperial Spy. Tamar's military fiction includes the novel The Last Battle, about a female veteran of the Iraq and Afghanistan wars, and The Fledgling's Inferno, science fiction about a genre that runs in military families and causes superpowers. Wow. Tamar's other contemporary novels are her most recent novel, Two Sisters of Fayetteville, as well as The Fourth Branch. Again, welcome to the show. And to get things started, Tamar, we'd love to know, I'm very, very curious to know how you got into writing about the Old West and then the Romanovs.
Well, it's very interesting. I mean, I'd always loved to read as a kid. And I loved history. I loved reading about American history, about European history, and I read a lot of different books. And I started writing for fun as a kid. Definitely by high school, I was writing for fun, writing stories, making up stuff as I went. And then I got into writing more seriously in college. I mean, I was a writer and editor on my school's newspaper for almost all 4 years that I was there. And then I started freelancing professionally when I graduated from college, writing for newspapers and writing for magazines. And all that has been really helpful and has helped me hone my skills as a writer.
Well, that's really awesome. So again, so how did you must have been really fascinated with just those two eras and couldn't decide.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, when I was in college, my mom bought me a book on Rasputin, and I did not know anything about him at the time. But my mom had read Massey's Nicholas and Alexandra, so she knew Rasputin was one interesting guy, and I loved that. And the next thing I knew, I was reading another book on the Romanovs and another, and I was just hooked. And that set me on the path for life.
Well, I understand that. It is a very fascinating history. I know there's been a lot of books written about the Romanovs and everything, but and for me, for one, I really love that era as well. So I'm fascinated with that you've written about that era.
Yeah, it's been fascinating to me. I mean, I was reading about the Romanovs for more than a decade before I started writing about them. And I think what drew me into that was wondering, what if the Russian Revolution had never happened? What if the hemophiliac Alexei had become Tsar? What kind of ruler would he have been? What kind of person would he have been? Who would he have married? How many kids would he have had? And that's when I ended up writing Triumph of a Tsar. It's alternate historical history. It explores a world where the revolution does not happen and Alexei comes to the throne. And it was a lot of fun to write. It had been many years of thinking about it and wondering, and finally putting pen to paper was really gratifying.
Yeah, alternate history is really interesting to write about, isn't it?
It really is. I mean, you really have to do research to figure out what could have really happened. And so for me, he marries Princess Ileana of Romania, and I really had to think about that hard. I mean, she was only a couple of years younger than he was. They had the same faith. And I think that was a big deal because religion was one pillar on which the Romanovs stood. And so it really has to be realistic.
Yes.
And so for me, my jumping off point was that Alexander II survives the assassination that in real life killed him. So in my book, he survives that, and he goes on to sign the Constitution that was on his desk that morning that he was actually killed. And so the Romanovs become a constitutional monarchy, and that's why they survive.
Well, that's really fascinating. So I was going to kind of get into about the research that you did. I'm sure it was extensive. Can you tell us anything maybe that you found that was kind of obscure?
Sure. I mean, there were a few things that I found obscure or interesting in that way. I mean, when I was doing research, I mean, just about the Romanovs, but for Triumph or Czar, but more generally, some lesser known fact that I found was that the Grand Duke Alexei, who was Alexander II's son, he actually came to America on an official visit, and he was the only Romanov to do that. And so he visited all the East Coast cities, New York, Boston. He even made a visit to the Naval Academy at Annapolis. And then he went out west to the Wild West, and he went buffalo hunting with Buffalo Bill. And those two things were just totally incongruous to me. I mean, you have the wealth and the splendor of the Romanovs, and then you have the Old West and Buffalo Bill. And it was really interesting for me because he came here in about 1872. And that's just when The Lonely Spirit, my short stories in the Old West, that's when they're set. So it's the same time period and the same setting, but it's just two vastly different characters. And before that, I did not really have the sense that those two people were happening at the same time. And it was just really fascinating for me to see that in my research.
That's really, I actually read another book that was that dealt with his visit. So whenever I came across that as well, I was like, what? I'd never heard that before. Because you're right, like two totally separate people from such vastly different backgrounds coming together, you would have never imagined.
Not at all, not at all. But Alexei's visit to the United States became one of the chapters in Tales of the Romanov Empire because I thought it was such an interesting feature of that period.
Right. Yes, it was. It was a very fascinating when we reviewed it. I remember that. Well, let me ask you this. So have you ever gotten a chance to visit any of the places that you talked about in your books?
Sure. I've been to Russia twice now. The first visit was about a decade ago. I did a river cruise from Moscow to St. Petersburg. So we visited both those cities and a few in between, Yaroslavl, Mandrogi, and that was just an amazing visit. And then more recently, when I was starting to think about writing Tales of the Romanov Empire, I did a trip between Moscow and the Golden Ring, which is the ring of ancient cities around Moscow. And it's really called the cradle of the Romanovs because Michael, who was the first Romanov Tsar, was hiding in a monastery in Kostroma, which is one of those ancient cities. And so this trip took me there, and I got to visit the town and visit the monastery where he was hiding when the Council of Boyars came and told him that he'd been elected to the throne. And so just seeing that building, seeing the monastery, it really gave me a lot of depth for the first story in Tales of the Romanov Empire, where you see the council, after 16 years of civil war, leaving Moscow to go find Michael and ask him to take the throne. And I think it gives it a really rich detail, having been there and having been able to describe the monastery and the building that he lived in because I actually saw it.
Right. I think that is a really great thing to be able to do that because it kind of gives you a different kind of sense of what it might felt like instead of just being able to write, from doing research in a book to be able to be there. It does, as a historical author, it really does kind of expand your reach whenever you're trying to write about it.
Absolutely. I mean, we were walking onto the grounds of the monastery and saw the sunlight sparkle off the golden crosses and the cupolas, and that definitely became a line or two in the book.
Oh, yeah. Oh, that's great. Oh, I'm glad you got to visit there.
Absolutely. It's really rewarding to be able to do that.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, let me ask you this. So do you have a favorite line from your own book that you could share with us?
I think it's not necessarily like a favorite line. I think that there are a lot of things that really jump out at me or really draw me in. I mean, and each book has a different draw for me. Yeah. I mean, I think for Tales of the Romanov Empire, in addition to the chapters we've already discussed, there are a couple of chapters about my great-grandfather and his emigration from Romanov territory into the United States. And so that for me was a very personal hook into this book and writing this novel. I did research into my great-grandfather and his arrival into the United States. I found out what ship he came over, what dates exactly, and found out more about what the voyage must have been like. and what it must have been like to just leave everything behind and flee oppression, basically.
Yeah. It's interesting that you said that, because I've had discussions before about um the they must have been made of different stuff than we are today,
I
because
wonder.
to leave everything behind like so many immigrants did, and sometimes never see their families again. It
Yeah,
just
that was true. I mean, I know my family, because we're Jewish, the Romanovs were very anti-Semitic, and there were definitely a lot of
right.
pogroms and a lot of anti-Jewish violence, and it was even illegal for Jews to emigrate. So my great-grandfather basically had to sneak across the border, and then once he got to America and established himself, he brought over his brothers. But he had one brother who went to South America, I think, or South Africa, and they never saw him again. So they never even had any idea if he'd survived the journey, and that must have been really tough.
Oh yeah, I'm sure it was. Like I said, they must have been made of different stuff than we are today.
Perhaps.
Of course, we've been through this pandemic, so maybe it's given us a little bit of
Yeah, I
a
hope
little
so.
of that back. Yeah. Well, what did you find was the most difficult about writing this sort of book?
I mean, for Tales of the Romanov Empire, definitely one part of that was just the wide breadth of history that it covers. The book
Yes.
starts in 1613 and ends in 1918, so that's more than 300 years of history.
Right.
A lot changed in that time. A lot
Yeah.
changed for Russia, a lot changed for the Romanovs, a lot changed for the rest of the world. And keeping that in mind was definitely a large task. I mean, as well as the fact that each chapter is about a different person. So the amount of research was very extensive. I often found myself reading several books just for each chapter in particular. And so
Yeah.
it's a lot to distill down into a single story.
Yeah. No, I totally understand that. I think most of us historical fiction authors can understand that.
But for me, I think part of the fascination with the Romanovs is that extensive history
Yes.
and that amount of history and the number of people that in the Romanov family and all the different stories that they had. I mean, I think a lot of people know about Catherine the Great or Peter the Great, but there are so many other Grand Dukes and Tsars that I feel like don't get enough attention, and that's a major reason why I wrote this book.
Yeah, that's wonderful. That's great to know. Well, let me ask you this. So, since we sometimes have a lot of um, like new writers that are just starting out in historical fiction, what kind of advice would you give your younger self in starting out in writing this genre?
I say to read widely, to write widely. I mean, I write in several different genres. I write a lot of different length books and short stories. And I think each has, I think with each of them, you really need to hone your skills. I think with the shorter genre, you have to say more with fewer words, and that's definitely a skill. So I would say to read widely, to write widely, to take a lot of classes in writing and learn
Yes.
as much as you can, and to bring all that skills to each piece that you write.
Yeah, I agree. I totally agree about especially about taking classes and everything. All of that really stretches you as a writer, and instead of getting so boxed in into thinking, oh no, I can't change anything.
Right.
We have to learn to do that, don't we?
Yeah, and I mean, I'm based in the DC area, and there's a writer center up in Bethesda, Maryland, that I've been taking so many classes at over the course of the years, and that's just been absolutely wonderful. They offer such a variety of classes, and they reach so many people, and the people that you meet when you're taking these classes, I think also strengthen your writing, just getting to know other people and their stories and why they're writing and how they came to their writing journey. I mean, all of it helps you as a writer as well.
Absolutely. And did anybody ever give you any like really good advice that has stuck with you?
I'd say one of my writer friends once told me, if you love it, keep doing it.
Yes.
Self-publishing can be a tough journey. And there was one time the two of us were commiserating, and she said that she keeps doing it because she loves it. And that's really stuck with me.
Yeah, that's definitely true, because there is um sometimes people like starting out get this concept of the way it's going to be, and then if it doesn't pan out, they give up. But
Yeah.
this is definitely something that you've got to push through, isn't it?
Absolutely. And I just saw something recently that, the more you publish, the more of a chance you have at really making it big. And
Yeah.
perhaps that's true. And I think at least for me also, really getting into my characters and really enjoying their journey and what they tell me as a writer and being able to put all of that down on paper has been very gratifying as well.
Yes, it absolutely is. Well, let me ask you this. So do you as a writer, and maybe just as a person, do you have a favorite quote that you live by?
I don't know about a specific quote, but the one I mentioned before from my friend has still stuck with me about if you love it, keep doing it. Because I think at the time we had that conversation, I was frustrated because I felt like I was not making a lot of progress in the manuscript I was working on. I felt like I was not reaching as broad an audience as I wanted with the books I had already published. And she said, I felt that way too at the beginning of my career and still feel that way sometimes, but I keep doing it because I love it. And I think that's been true for me too.
Well, that's really good. Well, so we would love to know, because since you've told us some about Tales of the Romanov Empire, do you have anything new coming up or any events that we should know about?
I do have a couple of manuscripts in progress. Interestingly, neither is historical. One's a middle grade fantasy that I've been submitting around to agents, and the other is a contemporary novel about a figure skater that's training for the Olympics. But after that, I have more Romanov novels in mind. So hopefully by next year, I'll get back to that.
Okay, well, that sounds great. Any events that we should know about?
Nothing specific upcoming. I'm looking at events for the fall, and we'll see how that goes.
Okay, well, be sure and let us know that, and we'll post it on our website so that people will know where you're going to be at.
That would be wonderful.
Well, that's great. We thank you so much, Tamar, for being on the show today. We really appreciate you being here.
Thanks for having me. It's been great.
Absolutely. And to all our listeners, we thank you and ask that you please click that subscribe button. And once again, you can learn more about Tamar and her books at www.tamaranolic.com. That's TamarAnolic.com. We hope everyone enjoyed today's episode. Tune in next week when we will be interviewing historical fiction author Jules Larimore with her featured book, The Muse of Freedom. Thank you so much for listening, and as always, keep making history and keep listening.